Over a period of 10 years, we were able to rear in captivity 331 kestrels that we released back into nature.
Welcome to another episode of Rewilding the World. I'm Ben Goldsmith, the host of this podcast series, and I'm very lucky and rather starstruck to be sitting here with Professor Carl Jones. I think this is the first time I've interviewed someone for this podcast series who I've known about and followed since I was a child in the late 80s, early 90s. Carl has been with the Durrell Wildlife Conservation Trust for 45 years now and has been heavily involved, emblematically involved, in the restoration of ecosystems and species in the island of Mauritius. Carl, thank you so much for taking the time to talk with me today.
Thank you. It's lovely to be here.
Carl, where were you born and raised?
Well, I was born and raised in rural West Wales, and I always had a great interest in wildlife. And my childhood was quite idyllic. I spent my time wandering around in the fields and the woods, and I used to keep animals at home. And as I got older, and I learnt about how many endangered species there were in the world, I thought to myself, I've got to try and do something about it. And then as a young lad, I read the books of Gerald Durrell, and he talked about breeding species in captivity and to be able to reintroduce them to the wild. And I thought, wow, that's just what I want to do. And so I grew up with this dream of one day travelling the world, working with endangered species and trying to save them from extinction. And it's really interesting because when I was in school, and I used to tell my teachers this, they used to be in a state of sort of disbelief. And one day my headmaster said to me, "Jones, what are you going to do with your life? You're not very good academically. What are you going to do?" And I said, "Well, sir, I'd like to travel around the world and save endangered species." And he said, "Jones, to do that, you've got to be either intelligent or rich, and you're neither."
It's absolutely marvellous. So, Carl, how did you then find your way to Mauritius? Where did you go first? And it's a long way away, Mauritius.
As a young boy, I used to keep animals in my back garden, and I used to breed common kestrels. I used to get injured birds and I try and rehabilitate them. And those that couldn't be released, I kept. And I learned how to breed owls and hawks and parrots and other species. And in the early 70s, I heard about the plight of the Mauritius kestrel. We were told it was the world's rarest bird. And in 1974, there were only 4 known individuals left on this planet. And everybody thought it was going to become extinct. And I knew I could breed kestrels. And I said to myself, I can save the Mauritius kestrel. And so I got in touch with a number of my friends. And through various contacts, they got in touch with Sir Peter Scott. And they said, we know this young Welsh boy who wants to go and save the Mauritius kestrel. And after about 6 months of hassling, the phone rang one day and said, would you like to go out to Mauritius and to work on the Mauritius kestrel? And of course, it was my dream job.
Carl, were you well travelled at that time already? Had you begun a life of adventuring, or was this your first big overseas trip? And what was it like arriving at Mauritius in the mid-1970s, as you did?
It was my first really big overseas trip. And of course, it was really quite a culture shock. I'd been brought up in West Wales. I went to college in London, and then I went to Mauritius. And of course, it was a very, very different culture. But I absolutely loved it. It was a simpler lifestyle, and I enjoyed the climate, and I enjoyed working with my colleagues there. And it was an absolute dream job. So I really landed on my feet. Of course, there were lots of issues and lots of problems. And trying to breed birds in what was then a developing country, of course, has its challenges. But I got on very well with the locals, and together we were able to achieve something.
So how did they do it? There were just 4 known individuals left. There you were, a young Welshman freshly arrived in Mauritius. A complicated political situation, as you've described it, among the organisations trying to do something about this. How did you get things going?
when I arrived, I didn't arrive until 1979, and there were already some kestrels in captivity. And they'd been trying to breed them for many years, but with all sorts of problems. And then in my first year in Mauritius, the captive kestrels all died. And of course, I felt devastated that there I was, the guardian of some of the world's rarest birds, and we had a small captive population. And they all fell off their perches dead. And at the time, I suspected it was some form of poisoning. And eventually we discovered that they were suffering from DDT poisoning that they'd used to spray the area to get rid of malaria mosquitoes. There were still only 2 pairs left in the wild. And so I rethought the whole project, and I spoke to a number of people who were experienced in working with falcons. And I came up with a plan of taking the eggs from the last wild pairs, hatching them in incubators, rearing them in captivity, ensuring they were in a clean environment, fed on clean food, and use those youngsters to establish a captive breeding project. And that's what I did. Of course, it took a few years, but I was successful in harvesting the eggs from the last wild pairs. And what was really interesting, there was a lot of opposition at the time. People said, you can't take the eggs from the last pairs of Mauritius kestrels. And I said, well, the chances are they will recycle and they will produce a second clutch. And in fact, one of the pairs did do that. And so we didn't really affect the wild productivity a great deal. And of course, with my experience of rearing kestrels in my back garden in Wales, I was able to hatch the eggs and rear the young, and eventually get them to breed in captivity. And I was lucky because I got sponsorship from an American organization called the Peregrine Fund. And I knew the president of the Peregrine Fund, Professor Tom Cade, and he sent over technicians to help me with the captive breeding. And we were soon able to establish a captive breeding program. And then I thought, well, there's no point in just having them in captivity. Let's put them in the wild. But of course, instead of just releasing them, I decided that we would train them so they'd be nice and tame and that I could call them back for food. And I would look after them in the wild. And so that's what I did, was I released captive bred Mauritius kestrels. I trained them to come into a whistle every day, and I fed them a white mouse. I put up nest boxes for them, and I nurtured these birds as if they were in captivity. I looked after them. They all had names, and every day I used to go on my bicycle, because in those days we didn't have many resources, and I used to cycle into the Black River gorges, and I used to whistle, and kestrels used to come flying out of the sky, and I'd feed them on a white mouse. And of course, by feeding them, you can increase productivity. And when they laid their eggs, when the captive birds started to breed in the wild, I took their first clutches so I could double their productivity. And over a period of 10 years, we were able to rear in captivity 331 kestrels that we released back into nature. And of course, we managed all those. I looked after them. I had nest boxes everywhere. And so I nurtured that population so that as it was growing, I was making sure that I was maximizing the productivity. We also did some predator control. There's introduced cats and mongooses on the island, so I made sure they couldn't get to the nest boxes, or I trapped them. And of course, the Mauritius kestrel population soon started to recover. And I have the most wonderful memories as a young lad, cycling up into the Black River gorges and whistling, and my birds coming down to see me. And for many years after, I could wander into the forest, and a kestrel used to come down and sort of say hello. And I always had a habit of making sure that in my pocket I'd have a white mouse. So if I ever saw a kestrel, I could feed it.
It's just such a joyful, magical, amazing story, Carl. And this is why you're one of the greatest heroes of rewilding and conservation that I've been lucky enough to talk to in this series. I mean, this species would have disappeared if it weren't for your expertise and your energy and passion for getting this done. What was it that originally did for the Mauritius kestrel? Why were they down to just 4?
Yeah, it's really interesting because the reason was DDT, that the island was one of the first places in the world where they were able to eradicate malaria-carrying mosquitoes. And this was a great success. However, it had a really profound effect upon the wildlife, and it nearly caused the extinction of the Mauritius kestrel. But of course, by the early 80s and the mid-80s, the amount of DDT in the environment was decreasing, and the habitat could now support more kestrels. And what we did was, when we released the kestrels, we didn't just release them into the Black River Gorges, we released them into other areas where they've been found historically, provided them with artificial nest sites, and fed them at least for the first few months to make sure they did well. So we gave them a helping hand. And of course, this is very often what you have to do with endangered species. You know, unfortunately, here in Britain, we've got this protectionist approach that if we actually just have a nature reserve and protect things, everything will recover. Well, protectionism works very well, but for the most critically endangered species, very often you have to give them a helping hand. And this is what we did with Mauritius kestrels, and it was very successful.
So what do they eat, the Mauritius kestrels? Because I thought Mauritius is one of those places that has very few or no native mammal species.
It's really interesting because we knew very little about the Mauritius kestrel, and we knew very little about the biology of many of the endemic species. And I remember in my first few years in Mauritius, I'd spend my evenings sitting in my little hut, reading scientific texts on the history of Mauritius and trying to find out as much as I could about the Mauritius kestrel and the other species I was working with. And the Mauritius kestrel, they said, was a bird feeder, that it fed on small white-eyes and other small passerines. But when I looked at the Mauritius kestrel, it didn't strike me as being a specialist on birds, because bird specialists have particular shapes to their claws and their beak and so on. And it showed all the signs of being a more generalist type feeder, or should I say, feeding on less agile type foods. And after watching them a great deal in the wild, we discovered that they were actually feeding on geckos, Phelsuma geckos. These are the endemic day geckos that you only find on Mauritius. And they were bringing back to the nest something like 95% of their diet was these green geckos. So quite a specialist falcon feeding on these geckos and other lizards.
Mauritius is a place of sort of wild dreams, really. You get descriptions of Mauritius when the first Europeans arrived, and I've got an image in my mind of dodos coming down to the beach, naive, friendly to the point of absurdity, easy for the settlers to just pick up and kill and eat. There were none left, of course, by the sort of early 19th century. I think there were giant tortoises. There certainly were in Réunion nearby. Can you just describe a little bit of what Mauritius used to be like before Europeans got there?
The Mauritius of today is a mere shadow of what it once was. The early sailors talk about landing on this wonderful verdant island that was just alive, pulsing with life. There were dodos that came to greet the sailors on the beach. There were giant tortoises. There were flocks of parrots. There was a multitude of reptiles, of lizards and skinks and multicolored birds, ebony forest and palm savanna, an absolute wonderful paradise, tropical paradise. And yes, people today think of Mauritius as a paradise island, but it's just a shadow of what it once was. And it's really interesting because as I used to wander in the Black River Gorges studying the birds, I always dreamt of coming across extinct species, or finding some part of Mauritius where nobody had ever been before, and to get glimpses of how Mauritius once was. And it was really quite interesting because I was there to work on the critically endangered birds to start with. But I couldn't get away from this vision of what Mauritius once was, and how could we possibly recreate it? The dodo was extinct. Giant tortoises were extinct. There were species of parrots that have gone on flightless rails. And I just kept thinking, wouldn't it be wonderful if one day we can rebuild this lost ecosystem? But of course, when species have become extinct, we cannot bring them back, not as yet anyway. And so I kept thinking, can we use other species to replace the extinct forms? Can we find a species to replace the dodo or the giant tortoise? Species that will not only fulfill their roles, but sort of interact with all the other species to help bring back a dynamic system. And so I had this dream very, very early on of what Mauritius was and what it could be one day.
To what extent has the landscape itself been altered? Does the habitat remain for those extinct species? I do remember my one visit to Mauritius in my teens, seeing forested hills and ridges and seeing some quite wild areas among the sugar plantations and the developed areas. To what extent does the habitat remain?
There's very little habitat left. The forest that you saw in the mountains is all degraded with introduced species. And of course, most of the vertebrates, the lizards and birds, have disappeared. However, we still have the plants surviving in small isolated populations. And we only have about 2 or 3% of native forest left on the island. So it's really been very, very badly devastated. But I'm a great believer that if you have the component parts, then perhaps we can start rebuilding those lost systems. And what we've been doing is we've been restoring areas of native forest, but also working on uninhabited offshore islands and trying to restore those. So, yes, most of the native habitat has gone, but we can actually bring back some areas of reasonably intact forest. And I've spent much of my career, as well as working with endangered species, rebuilding ecosystems. And I've been working on several islands, trying to rebuild those islands as they once were, or as near to them as we can, a facsimile of what they once were.
What about Réunion, which is a French territory that isn't far from Mauritius? That seems to be more intact from what I've read. Are those species similar species? Could anything be brought from Réunion to Mauritius as part of habitat reconstitution efforts?
Those are ideas that we've been pursuing for many years. It's really quite interesting because Réunion has lost as many species as Mauritius has. And it seems quite clear that the early colonizers ate their way through many of the endemics that were on La Réunion. However, there are species elsewhere in the Indian Ocean that we can bring back to Mauritius as sort of ecological replacements. And one species that I have been working on are the giant tortoises. Mauritius once had its own endemic giant tortoises, but unfortunately they became extinct in the 17th century. And we've been bringing back Aldabra tortoises as possible ecological replacements. And that's been going very, very well.
This episode of Rewilding the World is very kindly brought to you by Uni, that's UNI, the world's first nature-friendly line of luxury body care. We've all heard about the harm that sun cream does to coral reefs, but it's not just sun cream and it's not just coral reefs. Well, Uni makes plastic-free, nature-friendly essentials like shampoo, conditioner, hand wash, and even natural deodorant, all full of nourishing ingredients such as seaweed kelp, aloe vera, and olive oil. We've been loving our Uni products, but don't take it from me. Here's my wife, Jemima.
Yes, I really love them. They're such clean and nourishing products. The microalgae body oil is so good and really smells amazing.
You can find Uni products at Space NK or at weareuni.com. Are those now living wild on the main island of Mauritius or just on the islets around the main island?
The tortoises were once very, very abundant, and all the early accounts talk about these herds of tortoises on the beach. And when I first got to Mauritius, I kept thinking, God, wouldn't it be great if we had herds of tortoises again? So I started talking to my friends and my colleagues in Mauritius, and I said, I wonder if we can find some tortoises from elsewhere and bring them back to Mauritius. And they all looked at me and they said, don't be silly. You can't put exotic animals on an island. We all know it causes more problems than it solves. And I kept thinking, wouldn't it be great if we could bring back a giant tortoise to replace the ones that had gone and to fulfill their ecological roles? And I started talking about it to some of our supporters and funders. And we even had major funders saying, if you do that, we will pull out of Mauritius. And they said, you cannot put exotic species on islands. And I started to think about it a lot more. And I spoke to some of my friends who were herpetologists. And I started to look at the role of tortoises. And I found that the tortoises would have been browsers and grazers, but they would also have dispersed seeds. And I started to work with a number of botanists, and we discovered that many of the plants had adaptations for coping with grazing. But a lot of these plants were now critically endangered and disappearing. And I kept thinking, well, I'm sure the tortoises would have maintained a habitat, a grazing climax habitat that they would have maintained. And I started talking to some of my botanist friends, and they said, no, tortoises, they'll damage plants. And I said, okay, let's do an experiment. Let's put them on some of the offshore islands. And I went to my government colleagues and I mentioned it to them, and they thought it was a terrible idea. Periodically, I kept mentioning that we should bring back tortoises, and they kept saying, don't be silly. These are nature reserves. We mustn't touch them. We just protect them. And I kept saying, we've got to bring back ecological function. Anyway, this conversation went on and on for many years. And I eventually discovered there were many species of plants that without having grazers in the community would very likely become extinct, because the tortoises maintained open areas where the plants would get lots of sunshine and there wouldn't be competition with some of the other species. And so I started framing the proposal. I kept saying, well, if we don't bring back a grazer, these plant species are going to disappear. And I started to find examples of plants that really needed tortoises. And it was quite interesting because on one of our island nature reserves, we have a path going right across the middle of the island. And on the side of that path, where everybody walks every day, there's a very rare plant called Phyllanthus mauritiana. And the botanists kept saying to me, oh, this is terrible. We've got this critically endangered plant that grows on the path and people are trampling it. What can we do? And I said, well, it seems to be quite happy there. And they said, well, whenever we dig it up and transplant it somewhere else, it dies. And then, of course, it was a light bulb moment. I realised that this was a plant that needed trampling. And the more we looked at the plants, we found that a lot of them were trample resistant. A lot of them needed to live in these areas that had been opened up by tortoises. And we were able to develop this hypothesis that we needed tortoises back to restore the plants. And as soon as we started framing it like that, there was a lot more interest in the work. And we were very fortunate. The conservationists didn't want to go near the idea, but I got support from some academic friends, and we got a PhD student to test the hypothesis by releasing tortoises on some of our islands and seeing what would happen. And it's quite interesting that as soon as we released tortoises on one of our islands, an island called Îles Aigrettes, they started to feed on fallen fruits of ebony trees. And these ebony trees were not regenerating very successfully. We'd get the odd sort of weedy sapling growing up underneath the mother tree, but there wasn't vigorous regeneration. And we found that the tortoises started to feed on these fallen fruits, and they started to spread the seeds around the island in their droppings. And all of a sudden, these young ebonies started to grow a lot more vigorously out of the droppings of the tortoises. And we started to see regeneration of the ebony in a way that probably hadn't been seen for centuries. And this gave us the evidence, the empirical evidence, to show that there was this intimate association between the endemic plants and the tortoises. And then we released some more tortoises on Round Island, which is off the north coast of Mauritius. It's about a square kilometre in size. And we now have 800 giant tortoises there that are breeding. And they're doing really well, because what they're doing is that they're feeding in areas and they're causing these open areas.
So where did those tortoises come from? And is there an opportunity, you think, to persuade the government to allow you to put them on the mainland itself?
The tortoises actually have a very interesting story, because Charles Darwin, when he was going around the world on the Beagle, went to the Galapagos where he saw the giant tortoises there. And of course, that was really inspired him and made him come up with ideas of how species vary on islands and so on, and eventually came up with a theory of evolution. And then when he came to Mauritius, he was disappointed at the devastation that had happened on the island and how the giant tortoises on Mauritius had become extinct. And he looked at all the other islands, or he knew about the other islands. He could see that all the giant tortoises in the Indian Ocean had become extinct, except for those on the island of Aldabra, which is one of the Seychelles group. And he feared that the Aldabra tortoises would be the next species to disappear. So when he got back to Britain, he got together with a number of his friends, and they wrote to the governor of Mauritius, and they said, will you set up captive breeding programs on Mauritius for the Aldabra tortoise, because we fear that it may be the next species to go extinct. Several tortoises were brought across to Mauritius, and large herds were established on sugar estates. By the 70s and 80s, there were still some tortoises around on sugar estates in large sort of fenced-in areas, but they weren't doing particularly well. And I was able to get a number of these tortoises and take them to Îles Aigrettes. And it's really quite interesting, because some of the tortoises, we believe, were some of the original ones that would have come over after Charles Darwin recommended they be imported into Mauritius. So we had these ancient old tortoises that we put on Îles Aigrettes, and they started breeding very quickly. And we've been producing over 50 young a year that we've been able to put on Round Island. And we're also thinking about putting them on mainland. And we've repeated this experiment on the island of Rodrigues, where we have them on a nature reserve that we've set up called Grand Montagne, and we have tortoises in a large fenced area there. So it's really quite interesting that we have, in the last 20 years, changed people's thinking away from we mustn't put any of these exotic tortoises in our forests or on our islands, to people now embracing the idea. And of course, we think this is really quite healthy, because, yes, it's not the same species, but it's fulfilling a very similar role to the extinct tortoise.
How substantial would the differences have been between the different Indian Ocean tortoise species and the Seychelles, Aldabra, Mauritius, Réunion?
Yeah, there were quite marked differences. And we found that on Rodrigues and on Mauritius, there was a browsing form and a grazing form. So you had the saddleback tortoises that would feed on leaves or bushes, and then you had the grazing one. But ecologically, we think they were fairly similar. I spent for many years working with the curator of reptiles at the Natural History Museum in London, an old friend of mine called Nick Arnold, who was a world authority on these extinct tortoises. and I talked through the idea of using the Aldabra tortoise as a replacement, as an analogue. And we actually did some experimenting. We worked with the Aldabra tortoise, but also with another species called the radiated tortoise from Madagascar. And we found that the Aldabra was better suited for the environment. It was more robust and it could climb over rocks and so on. And we thought that the Aldabra would actually be a good proxy because it grazes and it browses. Although, in the future, yes, we would like to bring back a specialist browsing tortoise. And there's only one left in the world, and that's in the Galapagos, where they have this Española tortoise that is a browser. And I have written to the authorities in Galapagos to see whether one day we can get some. But at the moment, they think it's a crazy idea to move the Galapagos tortoises around the world. But who knows? I think it'd be a lovely idea to bring saddleback tortoises from the Galapagos to reinvigorate this lost niche of the browsing tortoise in Mauritius.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more, Carl. And I suppose this is the big difference between the rewilding movement and the conservation movement. Conservation has played a vital role in saving endangered species and the last precious intact places in the world. But there's often, I think, too much caution in the conservation movement and not enough open-mindedness towards projects like this. We're restoring proxy species in places where the originals have gone extinct, for example. I think a little bit more bravery and a little bit more urgency is required if we're going to make these things happen. Do you think that the government and people of Mauritius, working with organisations like yours, will find sufficient ambition to restore large-scale habitat, with proxy species or the originals, depending on what's possible? Do you think we'll see the rewilding of Mauritius in the next century?
I don't know, but I'm a great optimist. I think you have to be if you work in conservation. Of course, we're not going to have large swathes of Mauritius restored for the very simple reason that it's a small island. It has well over 1 million people living there. In recent years, it's become a highly developed country. A lot of the island is being put over towards industry and agriculture. The best we can do at this stage is to restore offshore islands, restore parcels of land on the mainland, and make sure we've got all the species, and where we can, restore functional systems. But what's really encouraging is that over the years, we've had many, many Mauritians working with us, and there's now a really strong ecological movement or conservation movement on Mauritius with the young people, many of whom have worked on some of the projects that I helped start. So we are seeing an awareness growing.
So I set up and chair an organisation called the Conservation Collective, and we established locally focused environment foundations around the world. In fact, the entire 21 executive directors in the network are all together in Devon this week for our global gathering. And we are working on plans for a Mauritius Environment Foundation at the moment. We're building a critical mass of support and hopefully looking for an executive director who can run it for us. And the goal will be to empower with funding and other support exactly those kinds of grassroots activists in Mauritius that you describe. Because that's the key. If you can give modest amounts of money, but also other kinds of support to grassroots initiatives, it's amazing what can be achieved. And your demonstration of that, the reason why you're an optimist is because of the unbelievable successes that you've had restoring kestrels and parrots and all these other species.
I'd been in Mauritius a few years, and it was quite obvious that what we had foreign scientists coming to Mauritius to tell the Mauritians what to do. And we really wanted to develop local capacity. So in 1984, I helped found an organisation called the Mauritius Wildlife Foundation, which still exists to this day. And in fact, this year we're celebrating our 40th anniversary. We're one of the largest non-government organisations in Mauritius. We have a staff of nearly 100 people. And we've seen it grow tremendously. And of course, although I'm still a director, I'm not doing the work anymore. I help advise it, and I go across. And in fact, I'm going out to Mauritius very soon. And I still help, advise and sort of direct the work. But the work in Mauritius is now being done by young Mauritians. And the young Mauritians that have grown within the Mauritian Wildlife Foundation. And over the years, we've helped many of those get higher degrees and become professionals in the field. Yes, this has to be the way forward.
Carl, you're an absolute hero of mine. I'm so grateful to you for taking the time to tell me these stories. I've loved every minute of this conversation, and I've long dreamed of rewilding in Mauritius, and it feels like amazing things have happened and even more amazing things are on the way. So I hope we can stay in touch, but I just want to thank you very much for joining me today.
And I'd like one day to take you to Round Island and to show you the giant tortoises and the recovering palm savanna and the tortoise grazing community that we've created. We've rebuilt and created a lost ecosystem.
I so loved that conversation with Carl Jones. What a legend of rewilding and conservation he has been for so long, and how amazing must Mauritius once have been. The idea of these palm savannas grazed by herds of giant tortoises, and how that could be a reality once again. It seems like Mauritius is on the track of restoration, not least because of the efforts of Carl and his colleagues over a number of years. I hope I'll have a chance to visit Mauritius again soon, and I hope you enjoyed the episode as much as I enjoyed making it. That's going to be the last one now for a while. We're going to take a little bit of a break over the summer. We'll be back in September with new episodes of Rewilding the World. If you haven't yet taken the opportunity to share the series with your friends, with your colleagues, on social media, given us a plug on whatever platform you use, please can I urge you to do so. It makes a huge difference in getting the word out there and growing the size of the audience. Thank you very much and have a lovely summer.
You already know that this isn't about one species. It's about systems, interdependence, collapse. And yet, wild salmon, one of the clearest indicators we have, are vanishing fast. Their decline signals something deeper, something more dangerous. I'm Jim Murray. I host The Last Salmon. It's not a side story. It's the biodiversity story that everyone like you should be listening to. Season 2's out now.
One of the best ways to support rewilding is to go and visit rewilding projects on the ground. My friends at the European Nature Trust have asked me to tell you about the series of coexistence adventures that they've put together. They're designed to give you the best chance of seeing Europe's most iconic species: bears, wolves, lynx, and so on. All of these are on the rise in Europe because of rewilding projects. These trips are hosted by expert guides and conservationists, and most importantly, the European Nature Trust is giving half of the revenues directly to the foundations working on the ground to restore wildlife. I'd love you to check out these coexistence adventures at the European Nature Trust website.